With this, dear guests, dear friends of the American University Kiev, welcome to the first AUK Talks for the 2023 academic year. As many of you know, the AUK Talks over the last year and a half have really become this primary venue in Ukraine for gathering global leaders in the field of security, politics, business, the academia, for really open and candid discussions with people like you, the members of the Ukrainian intellectual elite, the military, of course, and then security professionals, diplomats, etc. So today we have the distinct privilege of hosting a veritable star of global security and a true American war hero, and I might add a great friend and a staunch supporter of Ukraine, General David Petraeus. This is the second time that General Petraeus has joined us. He gave a talk back in May, and we appreciate, General, your continuous support for our university and our academic endeavors. General Petraeus is a partner in the global investment firm KKR and also the chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which he founded back in 2013. He's also a member of the boards of Optiv and OneStream, a strategic advisor for Semperis, and the chairman of the International Advisory Board for Advanced Navigation. And he's also engaged in various academic endeavors. As I understand, most recently, sir, you were named the Kissinger Senior Fellow at Yale University Jackson School of Global Affairs, where you'll be teaching a course on great power competition, which is what we'll be discussing.
what we're engaged in right here in Ukraine.
Exactly. And General Petraeus is also the co-author with Lord Roberts of the forthcoming book titled Conflict, The Evolution of Warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. Previously in his military career, General Petraeus served for over 37 years, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands as a general officer, 5 of which were in combat, including commanding the surge in Iraq, this very complex, massive operation which really defeated Al-Qaeda back in the day and ousted it out of Iraq. Later, he was the commander of U.S. Central Command in Tampa, Florida, and also commanded the coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his retirement from the military and after confirmation by the U.S. Senate in a vote of 94-0, mind you, he served as the director of the CIA during a period of significant achievements in the war on terror. General Petraeus has been named one of America's 25 best leaders by the U.S. News and World Report. He was the runner-up for Time Magazine's Person of the Year, and 3 times one of the Foreign Policy Magazine's top 100 public intellectuals. Also, General Petraeus has earned numerous awards and decorations, including 4 Defense Distinguished Service Medals, the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Medal, the Bronze Star Medal for Valor, 2 NATO Meritorious Service Medals, the Combat Action Badge, Master Parachutist Wings, congratulations, and the Ranger Tab. He also has been decorated by 14 foreign countries, and probably the greatest award of all, he was sanctioned by Russia. All right, absolutely. So we in AUK, we are of course honored and thankful for those visionary talks offered by General Petraeus, but also we appreciate greatly his generous support for the university, which has come in the form of providing a full scholarship and a mentorship for one of our new AUK students, Arsen Snitzer. Arsen just started his studies in the bachelor's program at AUK in data science. We're so proud that you, General, have made such a major individual contribution to the education of Ukraine's future leaders who will receive an American education, the best education, and then use it to rebuild their country. And Arsen is indeed one of those future leaders. As we all know, nowadays the children of Ukraine are able to study because their parents, their mothers and fathers are fighting in the battlefields against Russia's aggression, and they're protecting both their children, they're protecting Ukraine, and of course, they're protecting the free world and democracy worldwide. So Ukraine's children are able to study while their parents fight and sacrifice their lives for the better future of Ukraine and of the world. Arsen's father was one of those heroes who have made the ultimate sacrifice while defending his country. All of us at AUK are deeply moved. We're eternally grateful for his service, his bravery, and his sacrifice. His medal for valor will be bestowed posthumously by Major General Vladislav Klochkov of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. So with this, Arsen, please join us here to receive your father's award. Arsen, General.
Congratulations on being here. Хочу і маю таку нагоду від імені Головнокомандувача Збройних сил України, від армії України, від всього народу України передати вам цю нагороду, тому що ми можемо розуміти поняття герой по-різному. Сьогодні герої – це ті, хто вчить дітей, хто працює на підприємстві, хто захищає свою батьківщину. Але ваша рідна людина, вона достойна нагороди Хрест хоробрих. Хоробрість – це здатність і властивість людини проявити волю і віру в небезпечній ситуації. Тому я хочу, щоб ти і далі пишався своїм батьком, ним пишається народ України, Збройні Сили України. І досягай тих вершин, які ти можеш досягнути, і доказати, що ти теж воїн і майбутнє нашої держави.
Come here. Right here. Wait. Stand here. Turn it like this. Come on back in here. Everybody put a hand on this. Put a hand on here. Put your hand here. We're very proud of you. Thank you. And congratulations.
Before we start, let me say a few words about our investors, the investors in this great education endeavor. We all understand that education forms an important part of Ukraine's defense system. It should be as strong, as resilient, and future-oriented as the Ukrainian armed forces themselves. We're happy that today, in the middle of this war, there are people out there who believe in Ukraine and its future as much as Ukrainians do. These people are our AUK investors who are with us today. So on behalf of the AUK faculty, please join me in a round of applause for our investors, for your dedication to help Ukraine resist, grow, and develop. Okay, General, welcome once again. It is, as I said, a distinct privilege and honor to have you here again with us. It is an extremely important moment. It comes on the wings of the visit by Secretary Blinken, whereby substantial, I would say a huge package has been announced, $1 billion, some of it frozen Russian money. Also the delivery of munitions with depleted uranium. So what is your assessment? Are we at an inflection point of this war? If so, how to continue and put additional pressure? If not, what else needs to be done? What else do we need to provide to Ukraine?
Well, first, just say thanks for the invitation to be here. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Thanks in particular to the investors for making this great institution viable. And thanks for the opportunity to help a child of a fallen patriot get this education. There's a foundation in the United States that is called Children of Fallen Patriots. My wife is on the board. We've been supporting this for 15 years. It ensures that every child of someone killed in the line of duty, mostly in combat, of course, in Iraq and Afghanistan, would be able to attend college. So that's why I sought to do that here. One of my West Point classmates has also supporting a child of a fallen patriot, and we hope to continue to spread that and perhaps gain additional support in that regard here. We have an enormous moral obligation, I think, to looking after the children of fallen patriots, and the biggest way to lift a burden off the surviving spouse of a fallen patriot is for that spouse to know that his or her son or daughter will be able to go to college, because that's what the fallen patriot would have wanted for his child. I also appreciate the kind introduction. I especially appreciate that you did not note that I was beaten out for Time Person of the Year by Vladimir Putin. This is very deeply personal for me here as well. That's why I'm so proud to have been sanctioned by him. But you mentioned, is this a key moment? I think it's always a pivotal moment. Having commanded a couple of different wars, you're always in some kind of inflection point or pivotal. I do think this is an inflection point because there is a lot that is riding on the success of this counteroffensive. And I think the Ukrainian forces have adapted very impressively to the realities of this battlefield, which, as a former soldier, no military plan ever survives contact with the enemy. In this case, it turns out that the enemy has much deeper minefields than is the normal doctrine for Russian minefields. And so all of a sudden, the capabilities to breach these minefields with these line charges, the line charge doesn't go the whole length of the minefield. It's not just 100 meters, it's 500 meters and more. This was not seen, so they had to adapt. And I think the Ukrainian forces have adapted very impressively, but it means that instead of the kinds of very dramatic combined arms operations of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles with artillery and so forth, this has turned out into a 10-man infantry unit taking the next tree line and then establishing a defense and then bringing others up behind and then taking the house across the field. And they've done it quite impressively, particularly, of course, in Robotyne. And you're now seeing that breach expand. You're seeing it being solidified on the flanks. You also have, of course, success around Bakhmut on both sides, the shoulders of that town, which used to be way out like this, and now they're way back like that. And then there's success also on the, if you will, the border between Donetsk and Zaporizhia Oblast. All of these are very important. But of course, the objective is to get to within the range of artillery to be able to interdict the line of communication that runs along the coast of the southeast part of Ukraine from Russia across and then down into Crimea. And then also, of course, ideally to interdict some of the bridges, the routes that come from Crimea into Ukraine, southern Ukraine proper, and ideally the Kerch Strait Bridge. This is a really important offensive when it comes to reducing the logistical capacity of the Russians. And again, as I said, there's been a very impressive adaptation. Ukrainians are keeping the Russians stretched out all along this very long 600-mile front. Keep in mind how long that is. That's, it's nearly 1,000 kilometers. That's 150 miles farther than the fight to Baghdad. I was a two-star general division commander during the fight to Baghdad. 350 miles was a heck of a long way, even for a unit with 254 helicopters. And this is 150 miles farther. So that whole front, they're keeping the Russians occupied and stretched out. And then they are trying to starve the Russians a bit, if you will, by not just making these gains on the ground slowly, determinedly, innovatively, adaptively, and so forth, but going after the fuel depots, the ammunition storage points, the Russian headquarters, the lines of communication to make those less trafficable, the reserve unit assembly areas, the bases all the way into Crimea, air and sea, And then, of course, the artillery units that are making life so difficult as the soldiers, Ukrainian soldiers, are working through these minefields, which are so deep that you can't breach it with these line charges. And that is going, I think, impressively. That will take time to see the results, though, because again, you don't starve an army overnight. You have to starve it over a period of time. You reduce what it can provide to its forces on the front lines. And then my hope is that at some point the Russian forces begin to crack, that the morale of them starts to crumble. And then you can get them moving, and then you can bring this combined arms capability to bear, I think, in a more decisive manner. But the key is, you'd love to cut that line of communication. That would be a fantastic achievement in this particular, if you will, fighting season. Now, I know that Ukrainians are going to fight whether it's raining, snowing, they're going to keep on fighting. But it's undeniable that the rain that accompanies winter is just going to slow things down. It's going to bog things down, literally. Tanks can't go across country and so on. So I think all of that is what is ongoing, and that is a pivotal moment. What is achieved here is very important, not just on the battlefield, not just for Ukraine overall, but for the world, because the world is looking to see success. The world has provided enormous amounts of assistance. Again, the United States now is at somewhere between $43 and $44 billion. Just to give you perspective, what the US has provided just since this latest war began, since the invasion of last year, is $10 billion more than the entire annual defense budget of Italy. And that's one of the largest, of course, European countries and largest defense budgets. There's only 3 others that are bigger in Europe, UK, Germany, and France. So it's a staggering quantity. That said, I would very much like to see an acceleration of the provision of training for the F-16 and the F-16s themselves. I would like to see a decision made to provide cluster munitions, not just for artillery, but also for rockets. What's very important is that the rockets have a longer range than do the artillery pieces. The US systems generally outrange the Russian artillery, but not enough. You need to push them back. And if you have the rocket systems with the longer range and quite substantial number of cluster munitions, that could be very, very important and very helpful. The artillery provided cluster munitions have been very, very helpful already. And then I'd like to see, obviously, additional air defense systems, because although Kyiv has quite a good integrated air and ballistic missile defense, Odessa does not. Other places are much more vulnerable, and we've seen the Russians going after the infrastructure for the ports, the agricultural exports, and so forth. And so all of these, I think, very important, and I'd really like to see the US make those decisions and to do it as expeditiously as possible, but noting how impressive, again, how staggeringly enormous what has been provided. To give you a little bit of context, the US has provided over 2 million artillery rounds for 155 millimeter howitzers. To give you a perspective on this, a 5-ton truck, standard sort of transport truck, carries 43 of these rounds. So do the math of 43 into 2 million. It's actually over 2 million now. It's 2.1 or 2.2 million. Just the sheer number of trucks. Again, that's just artillery rounds. That's not tank rounds. It's not all the other materiel, the other ammunition, the other weapon systems, and so forth. So it's an extraordinary quantity. And we're also now seeing the very impressive Ukrainian innovation start to show itself. The Ukrainian-produced drones, Ukrainian-produced air drones, maritime drones. This is cutting-edge stuff. This is the future of conflict. And so, again, yes, this is an important moment. There may be as much as 4 months, give or take a couple of months, literally, before, again, rains come and it slows down. It won't stop. The Ukrainians are going to keep on going. But what is achieved during that time is very, very important because, again, it shows a signal to the world that Ukraine can continue to liberate its soil. It's determined to do that. We know of the resolve and the resilience and all the rest of that. And now what we're seeing is on the battlefield, very impressive adaptation because the scheme of maneuver originally conceived, again, collides with reality in the form of these the Russians have not been particularly impressive militarily. They are impressive in the defense. I've never seen it in my lifetime. I can't think of a defense that's remotely as formidable as is this defense. It's three lines, literally, of layers of defense, each one of which consists of tank ditches, very extensive minefields, sometimes with additional mines put on top of the anti-tank mines, dragon's teeth, other obstacles to vehicles and weapon systems, obviously trench lines all over with soldiers, and then artillery units and drones on top of this that are being used as forward observers for the artillery. So, and the Russians using electronic warfare much more effectively against the Ukrainian drones now as well. So I think you may hate your enemy, and I do, but I think you have to respect the capability of the enemy in this case. And again, this defense is formidable, but the Ukrainian forces are making progress through it. And that's very impressive and very important.
Which gives me the opportunity, General, to ask you, of course, we'll delve into the specifics of all these important weapon systems that you mentioned, airframes, of course, HIMARS, cluster munitions, potentially ATACMS, and others. But I understand that you had a meeting with the new Ukrainian Defense Minister, Mr. Rustem Umarov. I would imagine you would have discussed a lot of this. How did you go?
Actually, it was a very, very impressive meeting. So, and I have a delegation, if you will, or a bunch of comrades, teammates. Most of them are old spies, I should note, that all speak Russian or Rangers and Special Forces or brilliant Ukrainian Americans or scholars. But I think all of us came away from this meeting. We weren't even certain we were going to have a meeting with the minister because, of course, it's his first full day in office, I believe, after being confirmed, I think, yesterday. And we were literally the first non-Ukrainians with whom he met. And he did arrive, and he laid out his priorities. And I was hugely impressed because it showed a vision about what a minister and a ministry should do in looking out to the future, talking not just about can we get ATACMS or can we get more artillery ammunition or can you get this or that for us, but talking about the culture that needs to be built in a military that still has the residue, the vestiges of the old Soviet top-down system. Now it's evolved enormously. And initiative, as I mentioned, innovativeness from the bottom up as well as from the top down. That's huge. Culture is what it's all about. And culture of learning, by the way. And here we are in a great academic institution. The military is all about learning, especially on the battlefield. The side that learns the fastest typically prevails. In fact, when we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, when I was a 3-star, between the 3 and 4-star tours in Iraq, we put in that manual that you have to have a culture of learning, and again, the side that learns and adapts the fastest typically prevails in combat. So to hear that was huge, and then to hear him talk about, again, not just the military and the fight and how's it going, and again in Robotyne, it was about education and training. Wow. I believe in institutions. By the way, what Ukraine is working to build is institutions. This is an institution. Rule of law needs to be an institution, not just one man. You can't rely. Look, as an investor with one of the biggest investment firms in the world, we can't invest in a country that doesn't have institutions. You might trust the president or the prime minister in a country for a period of time, but you can't base an investment on that for billions of dollars. So again, hearing all of this was very, very impressive. And it's great to see that that kind of thinking is ongoing, even as you're trying to win a war. You have to think about, how do you win the peace? How do you win what follows? And of course, there's also a lot of great work like that going on to address the issues that have kept Ukraine from being all that it could be in the past, again, including legal institutions, judicial institutions needing reform, anti-corruption, monopolistic practices in key sectors, all the rest of this. And again, this place can be can play a significant role in that regard. And I hope and think that it will.
And indeed, there is no doubt that this war is a battle of wills and of creativity. And of course, we have also the confidence that Ukraine will ultimately prevent. But it is also a battle of supply, of weapon systems with their specific technical details, with their requirements. So let's go back a little bit to some of those. You have here representatives of the Great Institute for the Study of War, Ms. Boyova. You quote them on a daily basis.
I'm on their board. We have the Petraeus Center for Emerging Leaders.
Fantastic. And we're all fans of their great reports that provide so much detail on a daily basis. So lately there was one whereby the Russian forces were complaining about counter battery capabilities, and then stating that they rely heavily on those Lancet drones and the multiple launch rocket systems. Given the fact that we've provided Ukrainians the 155 howitzer ammo, but the Russians the MLRRs are so far behind the line, how do we break this vicious cycle? How do we get them systems that can hit those and silence them?
Well, Ukraine has at least 20 just US HIMARS, multiple launch rocket systems. These are the wheeled version of this with 6 pods on it. You have others from other countries. The key, I think, is actually more munitions for it. There is a longer range. We started out with the standard munition. Then we provided it's basically a bomb that's delivered by ground launched small diameter bomb. That takes you out to 150 kilometers. The ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, would take it out to 300 kilometers, and that's a 1,000-pound warhead. We shot 103 of those during the fight to Baghdad, so I have a reasonable familiarity about what it can do, and it's devastating. And I hope that can be approved, and that it will be approved. But also, again, as I mentioned, the munitions, so you don't just have the unitary round, but you have the cluster munitions, because they can saturate an area, and you can take out an entire artillery unit with that. And that's the so again, how do you push them back? You use something that has longer range than they do. The MLRS outranges the artillery, definitely it outranges some of depending on which munition, the Russian multiple launch rocket system. And then if the Ukrainian drones can accurately identify these, then you can of course take them out. But it's a matter of providing additional types of munitions, so the approval of cluster munitions for rockets as well as for artillery, and then providing even additional of the existing rounds and so forth. And again, the US is working hard to do all of this. The truth is that we have not seen consumption rates remotely like this. I look at the consumption rates even during the intensive combat phase of the fight to Baghdad, which was only a few weeks in the end. And we didn't shoot remotely, not nearly what is shot here almost in a single day. And so our own military industrial base is having to ramp up. I think we were producing 20,000 rounds per month, and now we're going up to 60,000. And so this is not something you can do overnight. You're talking about having to expand factories, reopen old ones, and so forth. And again, that's just one category. And the consumption rates here are staggering across the board. And so that's what we have to do. And of course, we're seeking to do that together with our other NATO allies. And keep in mind that the EU countries have been enormously supportive. They actually have provided more than the US in aggregate when you bring into account economic and humanitarian as well as security assistance. I think they're up to as much as $120 million, Dr. O'Hanlon calculated the other day. Our security assistance is substantially more than all the others put together, though. And so this is where we need, again, and European countries are recognizing this. At the NATO summit, there was a recognition that NATO countries have to increase their production of munitions that they didn't think they were going to be shooting or providing to someone else to shoot anytime soon. So that's the challenge. But what's very interesting, we also last night had dinner with the Minister of Strategic Industries that many of you may know he's just a sheer genius in my view. He's an incredible leader. He also has the most stylish haircut of any minister in the Ukrainian government. This is the shaved head to the side and the small pencil-thin braid. And we meet with him every time we're here, and he's delightful. By the way, I should note that Sean Penn joined our dinner, Sean Penn, the actor. And then maybe some of you know Chef Andres, who's this guy that feeds the world $450 million worth of food so far, came as well. It was quite a meeting. But what was laid out to us by the minister and then also the individual who runs your military industrial complex of nearly 100 different companies is how much you are ramping up and how you're actually on the cutting edge of some new technologies that are being used in unmanned maritime systems, unmanned air systems, and so forth. So I hope that Ukraine is going to be a destination for investment for European military industrial companies in particular, because labor is much more plentiful here, it's also cheaper, and it's a very, very high quality. So again, you can see all of this stuff, and sorry to expand a bit on that, but these are really important developments because at the end of the day, clearly the war is not going to be won in this counteroffensive. Already Ukraine, rightly, and other countries are preparing for the offensive next year, and that's the way we need to approach this. This is going to be a marathon, not a sprint.
Absolutely, and the rate of production, as you correctly pointed out, depends on so many new factors, so many additional factors, and we've been for 2 decades of fighting different wars in the Middle East.
Yeah, that's the other thing. I mean, again, the counterinsurgency campaigns that we were engaged in did have some very significant combat at various phases, but by and large, we weren't shooting lots of artillery, we weren't shooting ATACMs after the fight to Baghdad, we weren't shooting a lot of these other munitions. We did drop a lot of bombs, so we have a lot of those.
Well, let me ask you about the ATACMs and then compare them with the HIMARS loaded with cluster munitions. So as far as I understand from what can be gleaned from open sources, we really have several thousand of those. I mean, I don't have the exact number, but the ATACMs are not in huge supply.
It's a challenge because when you get to that range, now you're starting to talk about, is this something where there's an opportunity cost for something that might happen in Korea? It's publicly known we did take 155 millimeter howitzer rounds from Korea and brought them here, but there's sufficient supplies there. But no, there starts to be an opportunity cost. Is this a system that could be used in a contingency in the Indo-Pacific region that you might imagine? And now you're starting to, there is some of that here, and that makes it much more difficult. That's a tough call for the national authorities in the United States.
And then, of course, we have HIMARS rockets loaded with cluster munitions. As I understand, they're in the thousands. Some were slated for destruction in Germany. So how would they compensate this debate?
Well, it's a different munition, and it's a much more useful munition for certain tasks. And again, it's an area weapon system rather than a precision weapon system. The small diameter bomb is again it's a sizable warhead, but a unitary warhead. This obviously saturates an area. And so for certain missions, this is a great option. So Ukraine should have it. You're already shooting cluster munitions. There shouldn't be a worry about that. Ukraine established conditions for the use of these munitions. They won't be used in built up areas. They're going to be mapped. There's a report that comes to the United States every month and so forth. So those are very, very good, again, control features, if you will, that satisfy people who are concerned about the dud rate and so on. But this is Ukraine liberating Ukraine soil, and I think Ukraine ought to be the one that makes the decision about whether it's going to add some additional unexploded ordnance to a soil that's already saturated with Russian unexploded ordnance, because they're using these munitions.
So presumably this HIMARS cluster munitions are the right weapon for exactly this type of campaign that you described?
For certain missions. Again, there's no weapon system that's perfect for everything. There's no, you need to always pick the right, just, even with artillery, there's no, sometimes you want point detonated, and sometimes you want delay fuse, sometimes you want air burst. This is the graduate school of use of indirect fire.
So if the Russians want to destroy more Russian, that is the Russians, need to be destroyed in terms of material and personnel, the Ukrainians would need to use HIMARS cluster rockets as the best option for some of these.
For some missions, yeah.
And then
not for all. There's places where you want to blow something up that's fixed site. You want the unitary round. But for some of these, but again, the bottom line is it should be in the arsenal, it should be an option, it should be available for those missions that are best suited for that kind of munition.
So you're talking about, say, if you want to take down the Kerch Bridge, then obviously unitary.
You're not going to take down the Kerch Bridge with cluster munitions.
With ATACMS.
You're not even going to take it down probably with an ATACMS. What you do there is what Ukraine did very impressively with the bridges that connect the west part of Kherson City, really, across the Dnipro, and that is you don't destroy the bridge. By the way, you may need the bridge, so you don't want to destroy it. You make it untrafficable, and that's how you do it. And of course, Ukraine's done this pretty well. They actually have damaged the Kerch Strait Bridge, as is well known, on several occasions, but there's going to have to be more lasting damage than that over time, and that can be addressed over time as well.
You also mentioned the DUD rates. This is the rate of unexploded sub-munitions or those bomblets within the cluster munitions. Obviously, the U.S. is keeping it at a couple of percent. I think 1.5%, 2%. The Soviet ones, the Russian ones, are very high.
Much higher. Yep.
How do we?
And some of the, again, there's sort of a threshold of 2% and below, and that's sort of an international standard or metric. The artillery rounds that we've provided do have a slightly higher DUD rate than that. The MLRS do as well, I believe. Again, there's multiple different types of these too. But again, it's still quite a low DUD rate. And at the end of the day, let's let the Ukrainians decide what they're going to do. This is Ukrainian soil. We're not doing this to some other country. You're liberating your territory, and if this is a way of helping you do that, and there's a residual price that will have to be paid in terms of demining or surface clearance, because these are surface, then okay, and let the Ukrainians make that decision. Just as, by the way, some of you will have seen, I had an op-ed piece in the Washington Post last week that basically said, let's stop this anonymous criticism of the Ukrainian tactics. The Ukrainians actually know their territory, their terrain far better than we do. They know their forces' capabilities far better than we do. They know their shortcomings, and there are distinct shortcomings for this type of mission with very long minefields. There's no air power to speak of. You don't have the armored breaching capabilities that we would use. So again, the Ukrainians are adapting to the reality that they're facing. Let's figure out how to enable them to do that ever more efficiently and effectively and for a longer period of time than calling into question whether they should be doing it this way or that way. So I think that the Ukrainians have done a truly magnificent job of assessing the situation on the ground, adjusting whatever plan they start with to the realities of that situation, and then very, very courageously and with enormous determination and resilience and skill implementing that idea. And a lot of this, by the way, it's coming from the bottom up. This is a good sign. Again, the Russian system, somebody doesn't have the courage to say, excuse me, Captain or Colonel, we need to adjust this. No, they just sort of take orders. And so this is quite impressive.
And so you're effectively saying that we should not try to micromanage extremely complex operation from a distance. What our friend Ben Hodges says, stop trying to deal with this 8,000-mile screwdriver.
Having been on the receiving end of the 8,000-mile screwdriver for many years of my life, actually, as you know, in 5 combat commands, nearly 7 of my final 10 years in uniform, I often tried to sever that 8,000-mile screwdriver. But, you know, there's a reality as well, and there's oversight, and, you know, just like the parliament should oversee this kind of, you know, get used to it. Washington does get a vote, just like Kyiv gets a vote, other capitals get a vote, and that's part of the reality of all this as well. And a commander in a modern day battlefield has to contend with that, you know, cheerfully, and to receive endless numbers of congressional delegations and visitors and leaders and guidance and suggestions and everything else. But at the end of the day, a commander has to make a decision and drive on and have the courage of his or her convictions. And that's what I see with the Ukrainian leaders.
And of course, they communicate their needs to our leaders in Washington. Sure. And what those leaders need to know and to do is that the Ukrainians also lack, unfortunately, air superiority, something that we would, you know, we're still.
Well, look, Russians don't have air superiority either. I mean, they have certainly much more air than does Ukraine, but they're quite restricted in their flying ability. They can't get too far over the Ukrainian forces or they're going to get shot down. They've lost a staggering quantity of fixed and rotary wing aircraft. And Ukraine has a very limited air force. It's quite a courageous and, again, skillful air force, but limited capabilities in the airframes and the radars and range and the munitions and so forth. The F-16 will help a great deal, but I think we have to be very careful not to think that there's any technological silver bullet, that if you just get the F-16 Block 52 or Block 60 or something, and all of a sudden you're going to win the war in 2 weeks. It's not going to happen. It will help. But by the way, even employing close air support is very, very tricky. I've nearly been blown up twice by missiles that didn't go where they were supposed to go. And again, these are huge munitions. And so that even that piece is going to be tricky. By the way, the Russians are terrible at close air. They don't do real close air support. That's, in other words, within, you know, very close range of soldiers. It's a very, very challenging mission. But again, we need to accelerate the provision of the X-16 training, maintenance training, munitions provision, spare parts, and all the rest of this. And there should be continued examination of other options. If the Swiss can provide their airframe, which is a very sturdy airframe, it takes less runway, it doesn't have the huge air intake, bring that on too. And I know there's discussion with the Swiss about that plane. Sweden, the Saab. Yeah.
How about the A-10s? Ambassador Volker reminded me, he keeps writing about this, they've been mothballed in the desert.
Yeah, you try to bring these out of mothballs, you try to bring them out. Again, that's strictly a close air support aircraft. It's a pretty sturdy close air support aircraft. We loved it right over our shoulder in a place like Afghanistan, but there's nobody trying to shoot it down. And as sturdy as it is and all the rest of this. And then, you know, again, there are opportunity costs. And if we spend US dollars, there are limits to US dollars. And if you spend it on that, you're not going to have it for this. One of the great outcomes of the F-16 is that it is not US aircraft being provided, US owned, it's US made, but it's being provided by the Danes, the Norwegians, and the Dutch, which is great. So it's not going to count against our limit on appropriation, which is very substantial, but it still has a limit. So anytime you can get a NATO country to provide a system like that, the better. But you know what, we should probably open it up to students here, because that's really what I assume some of them at least came here to ask questions. Yes, and so, and I see hands. And so how about the man with the pink shirt right here?
Taras, Mr. Dumic, and then we'll go with...
We can hear you if you speak loudly enough. Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you for coming to Kyiv once again. Mark said it's the second time, but for us it's actually the third time that we have an opportunity to listen to you and to communicate with you.
That's right, I did a virtual.
Yes, yes.
Exactly.
And that was very sharp meeting and very useful. And thank you for the emphasis that you make on institutions and following our actually last discussion. I appreciate the follow-up from you on .mil.pf.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
Yep.
I'm now trying to apply that in a kind of a civil world, and it looks that it's actually very much applicable. And I believe that based on your experience, you've dealt a lot with the civil side of public officials. Even when you were an army general, because a lot of what's happening, a lot of strategy depends
Yep.
really on the government. And I was wondering, what would be if you were an advisor to our government, to our president, what would be your advice on the strategy that our government should take with respect to our allies, as well as the countries that we would want to become our allies, like the countries
Sure.
of the global south,
Yes, yeah, yeah.
as well as China.
Yeah.
And Mark might remember that one of his class, when we
Yep.
were playing on the China thing, I was trying to apply Sun Tzu principles toward that. And the way we see our army fight, it looks that our army has been very successful actually in applying those Sun Tzu principles, and that's why there is this progress. So
Yeah, let me address that. Because I think it's actually pretty easy. I think that your president and your government writ large, foreign minister in particular, some other select ministers, defense minister previous, and I think this one, have done a brilliant job of communicating with the most important governments of the West, then even communicating again with China and India. Keep in mind, when it comes to deterrence of Russian use of nuclear weapons, the most important voices on that might be those of President Xi and Prime Minister Modi. Yes, the US and others, and even some of us on the sidelines have said this is what would happen if you do that. Don't do it. Bad idea. You think you're in a tough spot right now, Russia. You think you're a world pariah right now, just use tactical nuclear weapons. And oh, by the way, they're not going to make any difference. The Ukrainians are going to keep on fighting, and life is actually going to get more difficult for you, not easier. So again, I think that the president, and he did visit that group that was hosted in Saudi Arabia. Very smart move. He has gone obviously to the G7s and the G20s, and he'll usually stop in other locations. He did a terrific set of visits to two of the countries that are providing the F-16s. I think it was two, maybe the third one as well. A lot of interaction with NATO. So, if I can come back to something that I emphasized before about strategic leadership, and of course, President Zelensky is sort of the ultimate strategic leader in this particular war. You have to get the big ideas right, the strategy, and you have to understand the context for that and all that. And then there's little ideas as well, but you have to get that right. Think about his response on the first day of the war. I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. That's a big idea. I'm going to stay in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. Men aren't going to leave. I mean, these are all really quite substantial big ideas. And then you get into the more consequential ones of, where are we going to do this, that, and the other thing. Then you communicate the big ideas throughout the breadth and depth of the organization, in this case the country, but also to all the other global stakeholders, if you will, to NATO, to non-NATO EU countries, the rest of the Western world, and then the global South. And I share your concern about the global South because there's a lot of effort by China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, some others, and you see this with the expansion of BRICS to a degree as well, to try to create, in a sense, alternate, not rules-based organizations, but alternatives to the US-led, established, quote, rules-based international order in the wake of World War II. And that's challenging, that's problematic, and so forth. And I am concerned about that. And I'm sure that Ambassador Volker in his time, as a diplomat sees that, especially having been the ambassador to NATO. But again, I think he's done that really quite brilliantly. And the truth is that he can do that better than the US president, given his position. By the way, the third task, then you oversee the implementation of the big ideas. He's doing that, I think, quite expertly as well. And by the way, among your big ideas, it's not just win the war. You got to do that or nothing else matters. But you even as you're winning the war, you have to think about, again, how are you going to win the peace, as I mentioned earlier. How do you carry through with these reforms that you were actually elected to implement? They have legislation. When I met with him the last trip, I asked him about, how can you get KKR to invest in your country? When it comes to these, and I ticked off the different areas that are ones that need improvements, and he laid it all out. Now, the question now is, okay, you got laws, you have policies, can you institutionalize them so that it's not dependent on one president, one leader to do that? And that effort is ongoing, but that's another set of big ideas. And then the fourth task of a strategic leader is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, how to adopt new big ideas, get rid of old big ideas, refine them, and do it again and again and again. This is a really good intellectual construct, if you will, for leadership at the very top. The truth is, though, it's good for leadership at any level. The difference is that leaders below the strategic level are constrained a bit in their identification of the big ideas, because somebody above them has sketched out the biggest of the big ideas, and so they're doing their level within the confines or the guidance or the direction of the strategic leader. By the way, for the younger students in here, a founder of a startup is a strategic leader, and you have to get the big ideas right. You got to communicate them. You got to oversee their implementation. You got to determine how to refine them and do it again and again and again. And I used this construct explicitly during the surge in Iraq. We thought through the big ideas, thought through how I'd communicate them, thought through how I oversee the implementation. There's lots of little individual elements of this, and then formally would sit down in a variety of fora where people would provide lessons that need to be learned or changes to the big ideas or what have you, and then would do the process again and again and again. And it was a very explicit, and there are a whole series of events on my battle rhythm, my schedule, that would force me to have to take these different actions. So I think, again, if you come back to your question, there's not a heck of a lot of advice that I could give to this president that he doesn't already know. I mean, you think about it, he's sent, literally now, is sent from central casting for this position. I mean, he was an actor. Who could communicate better? Then the question is, could he get the big ideas right? Boy, has he ever. And then the oversight, the managerial skills seems to be coming along well as well. And then you look at the quality, again, of the various ministers, and I know the foreign minister very well, and the new minister of defense, as I said, was just hugely impressive right off the bat. There's just something, the vision that he was thinking about was what a minister needs to do, rather than, again, looking over the shoulders of the soldiers on the ground and telling them to go left instead of right or something like that. So I think this is a very impressive government. I think it's done a magnificent job for Ukraine. Other questions?
Okay, Valery Kravchenko from the Foreign Ministry.
Please tell Minister Kuleba that I said good things about him.
Yeah, thank you for your speech, for introduction. And first of all, I would like to thank you for strong support of US people, and enormous support, I would say, of our struggle in this aggressive war of Russia against Ukraine. Now we have this formula, and everyone knows how it takes. So it's as long as it takes. Of course, we are looking to the future and see the elections in the United States next year. And we are a little bit worried about the future, of course. But my question is a little bit different. It's not about the steadiness of the support, but it is also in one part of it. You personally know what is Afghanistan. You were in Afghanistan, and you know this Afghan story and probably Afghan trauma for US leadership also. And my question is, what is a principal key difference between the Afghan story and Ukraine story from the perspective of American citizens, American leaders? I believe that Ukraine, and in particular Ukraine armed forces, could make US great again. But in general, in the United States, how it's percepting this story in Ukraine? We see all this negative dynamics in polls, unfortunately, about the support, the steadiness of the support, and how it will influence in future. So that is my question.
Yeah, look, I think for starters, a very big difference between Ukraine and Afghanistan is the strategic leadership at the top levels in the respective countries. I just laid out why Ukraine is incredibly fortunate to have not just a president, but others who have demonstrated extraordinary leadership. And candidly, in the case of Afghanistan, there was some disappointment there. You know, when the president gets on a helicopter and leaves the country, that's not quite the inspirational example that you would hope would inspire the soldiers to continue to fight. And there were a lot of other issues also involving the actual strategy on the ground, the way they were carrying it out. There were a lot of shortcomings and deficiencies. I personally, by the way, felt that we should not have left Afghanistan. I felt there were alternatives that were very affordable and very sustainable in terms of the cost in blood and treasure. Those are the two metrics that matter. We hadn't even lost a soldier in combat in 18 months prior to the terrible bombing at the gate of the airfield during the evacuation. So again, I thought I would contend, in fact, that the decision to leave Afghanistan, which of course is made by one president and then carried out by another, who could have reversed it but did not, did reverse a lot of the other foreign policy decisions of his predecessor. But that decision and then the way in which we conducted the evacuation was probably seen by Vladimir Putin as a sign that, you know what, I go into Ukraine. Of course, he vastly overestimated his own capabilities and completely, totally underestimated the fighting capabilities, spirit, determination, and expertise of the Ukrainian forces. But I think he probably thought that he would not see the response from the United States and NATO and the West that he has seen. For all of my questioning of the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way it was carried out, I think that the United States government writ large, the president, the executive branch, and Congress have done a very impressive job, not just in providing support to Ukraine, but also by leading the rest of the Western world, if you will, the world that values the democracy and free market economics and so forth that you see here on the ground, however imperfect that may be and however imperfect all systems are. So I think that's first and foremost. And I should note, I actually met with one of your parliamentarian groups yesterday that does the oversight of national security, defense, and intelligence. And they reminded me that at the Munich Security Conference, that ended a few days before the the latest invasion of 2022, that I asked them very pointedly. They said, do you have any questions for us? And there were no press in there. I was the only one. They wanted a meeting with me after the Viktor Pinchuk hosted event that I spoke at. And I said, I do have a question. And given the recent experience that we had in Afghanistan, are you going to fight? And I said, I'm not talking about your soldiers. I'm talking about you. I'm talking about your sons and daughters. And they all said, absolutely, we're going to fight. And that was the moment. I thought they would, because I'd already, a couple of years earlier, I'd been down to Donetsk, I'd seen the front lines. I realized how far Ukrainian forces had come since I'd engaged with them in a serious way. Keeping in mind, by the way, the first time I came here, it was still part of the Soviet Union. I was the aide to the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army who made the first visit to Russia, or the Soviet Union, since George C. Marshall went to Yalta during World War II. So it was quite a historic, and we went to Moscow, Kiev, and what now is St. Petersburg. And then have been coming regularly since then when it was newly independent and so forth, and then on. And I had a sense that the Ukrainians were going to fight, but hearing that was very, very reassuring. And they did fight, and incredibly. I did say, by the way, before the invasion, that I did not believe that the Russians would be able to take Kyiv, much less control it or topple the government. Part of that's because I know Kyiv and it's so sprawling, and I can envision the defense. You get enough partisans out there and you can stop them as long as something catastrophic doesn't happen, which almost did happen. If you think about the seizure of Hostomel, if that could have been seized intact and just plow planes in there with troops and then get them right into Kyiv and somehow carry out some kind of decapitation, that could have been a serious threat. But it didn't. There was a courageous defense there, courageous, tough fight. And once that was decided, I think it was pretty clear they weren't going to be able to penetrate. Let's keep in mind that Russia lost the Battle of Kyiv. It lost the battles of Sumy and Chernihiv and Kharkiv Oblast, Kherson west of the Dnipro. All of these, this is extraordinary stuff. But again, the difference is what I've just recounted versus what happened on the ground in Afghanistan. And there's a lot of reasons for that. In fact, I laid them out. I examined that in an article in Atlantic Magazine if you want to go back and look at why we did not achieve what we should have achieved in Afghanistan. And one big reason, by the way, remember strategic leadership, we didn't even get the inputs right for the post-invasion Afghanistan until 9 years after we invaded and toppled the Taliban regime and ran the Al-Qaeda sanctuary out of Afghanistan. 9 years to get the right big ideas, the right level of resources, the right organizational architecture, the right leaders, the right preparation of our forces, the right doctrine, the right other resources beyond military, so diplomats, spies, development, rule of law, all of that. 9 years, that's too long. And we squandered 9 years where there was a relatively low level of violence, didn't build institutions. Those institutions proved incapable when they were under enormous pressure. And of course, you had a problem, massive problem with sanctuary in Pakistan for the Taliban and the Islamic movement in Uzbekistan and the Haqqani network. So enormous differences. And frankly, Ukraine is a heck of a lot closer to our single biggest trading partner as a bloc, and that is obviously the EU. It's a heck of a lot closer to NATO, and it has been posed by one of the true great powers that has revived, if you will, an era of renewed great power rivalry. Keep in mind that over the last 10 years, we've transformed, the world has transformed from one of benign globalization to renewed great power rivalries. That's seismic change. That is tectonic plate shifting change. And that's the context in which this is playing out. And again, a threat by Russia is very, very significant. So again, there's lots of difference, but the biggest is the Ukrainians are fighting. And they're fighting, you know, I think it was Senator McConnell, wise man in the Senate, the minority leader in the Senate, who said that with 3% of our defense budget, we have cut the Russian capability in half by investing that 3% in Ukraine and Ukrainian forces. Next question.
I want to give a chance to Ambassador Bezhoshvili. I think you have a question before.
Who also has experience being invaded by Russia.
Yes, we do. Without further introduction for the sake of the time, David, first of all, thanks for being with us, and David and I were proud to be a part of this great institution. We just became investors, and we will be investing in a freedom and democracy of this country in the long run. In your last remarks, I think you spin out a little bit the content of your future book, because you know this news of your book struck me, and if you can a little bit give us more about what the book is all about.
Sure,
And
yeah.
maybe in that book, you have a question, 1 million question. Why Russia started this war?
Yeah.
Was it
Yeah.
all about
Yeah.
establishing, reestablishing their influence
Yeah.
in post-Soviet space, or
Yep.
it's bigger than that? So please, if you can, I think our students would be very much interested.
Let me start by giving my try at that, although I almost should defer to the former Russia senior experts at the CIA, but they can grade my work in a second here. Essentially, this war is the product of the revisionist, revanchist, grievance-filled view of the world of a kleptocratic leader of a once great nation that he believes should be great again. And of course, he set out to make Russia great again. What he's really done is make NATO great again. You know, the greatest gift to NATO since the end of the Cold War is Vladimir Putin. So a colossal miscalculation. But I think there were other factors. I think we didn't react as strongly as we could have when Abkhazia and South Ossetia were invaded. We didn't respond as strongly as we might have in 2014. There was a red line in Syria that turned out not to be a red line. We haven't been quite as firm as we might have been in the South China Sea. Again, you look around the world. I remember sitting down with the Prime Minister of Singapore one time after one of these events, and he said, you know, General, keep in mind that what happens elsewhere reverberates out here, and it can either strengthen or undermine deterrence. And I think in this case, then you add in the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan and the way the withdrawal was conducted, and Putin looks at that and says, with this twisted mindset, I think I can get away with that. They don't have a right to exist anyway, and so forth. And so that's, I think, how you end up with this colossal miscalculation, then a huge intelligence failure by his individuals. And also you see the manifestations of corruption in a system. One observation, if I might, you know, as a commander of forces, if you'd given me 3 or 4 months in the field with my units, as the Russian commanders had to the east of Ukraine and then in Belarus, I'd sure like to think that I could train them a hell of a lot better than the Russian forces did. And it seems to me that they were just out there camping out. They weren't training. There was nothing rigorous about, and the deficiencies in basic tactical tasks were glaringly evident as a result of that. But the book basically, you know, it is the evolution of warfare from 1945 to Ukraine. There are chapters on various of the sort of smaller wars than some individual chapters on Korea, US and Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. Those two, by the way, I wrote in the first person. All the rest of the book is a traditional third person with my great historian comrade, Andrew Roberts, now Baron Roberts of Belgravia. And then we have a chapter on the future of warfare as well, which is interesting because we're trying to reconcile, is Ukraine the future of warfare? And the truth is, it's not. But there are glimpses of the future of warfare. I mean, Ukraine is this hybrid. We used to talk about hybrid war, you know, the Gerasimov hybrid war. That was maybe Crimea at its height, the only really success in that regard. But there's elements of World War I here, obviously, trench lines, huge defenses, depth, all of that, massive artillery, and so forth. Certainly there's World War II with quite modern or Cold War plus armored systems and so forth. But then there's actually a context of the future in which every individual on this battlefield has a smartphone, some access to the internet and social media platforms onto which you can upload videos, photos, data, what have you. That's transformative. And then you obviously see what is the future of warfare, which is unmanned systems, some of which are remotely piloted, and others of which are starting to be algorithmically piloted. That's the future of warfare. And you're seeing it not just in the air, where we've seen quite a bit of this in recent years, including in the wars that I was privileged to command, But you're seeing it also on the surface of the sea. We'll see it subsea. That's a whole big different challenge because now you don't have access to GPS, so you have to have advanced position, navigation, and timing underwater. We'll see it in the space in the future, and you actually are already seeing it in some respects in cyberspace as well, because there's a war going on there. And by the way, I think one of the myths of the early period of this war is that Russia didn't really bring it all in cyberspace. They actually did, and Ukraine got much better because of previous, taking down the .gov site or taking down the electrical generation at one time, that kind of stuff. And the US actually got better as well, and the integration between Microsoft in particular and then government agencies and others has really quite dramatically improved. So that's what's in that. And if I could, the common theme through all of this comes back to what I was talking about earlier. Wars are typically won by the side that has great strategic leadership, that gets the big ideas right, that communicates it, that oversees the implementation, determines how to refine it. And in some cases, that's the other guys. The great strategic leader of Vietnam is not a US general. It was General Giap of the Vietnamese forces, North Vietnamese forces, which first defeated the French at Dien Bien Phu, and then he was the overall essential commander and minister of defense and so forth. In other cases, it is on our side. But this issue of strategic leadership is crucial. And then you actually have examples where I think we had pretty decent strategic leadership after a while or for a period of time, but didn't sustain it. And so as the theme, and again, perhaps for future leaders, this construct is pretty valuable. For what it's worth, we distilled this construct at Harvard at the Belfer Center. If you go to belfercenter.org and search for Petraeus on strategic leadership, there was a group of graduate students there. I was a fellow there for 6 years, non-resident, part-time thing. And the students who all fought for me basically, and they wanted to capture this and to distill it. And so we did that. It's a series of interviews and descriptions, and I can do this for Netflix as well, just as well as the surge in Iraq or Ukraine. So it's applicable in business. We have time for one more question?
Yeah, one more question from a student. I saw a hand over there. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. First of all, thank you for your talks, and I have a question. I think it's a fact that we will reach the victory because all of us, students, military, soldiers, and other working professionals, we're working for the victory, yeah? And based on your experience, will it be enough for Ukraine to just get back our territories, or Ukraine need to do much more?
It'll take more, and so let me lay out what that might be. There is going to need to be an ironclad security guarantee. The ideal form would be, I think, former ambassador to NATO, would be NATO membership. I think that's the form it will take. The problem with that is obviously it's difficult to bring a country into NATO when it's at war, especially if it's at war with Russia. You can understand that certain of the NATO members might, and again, it operates on consensus. So that's the challenge. That's why NATO couldn't last year say, here's a date certain for when you'll be a NATO member. They did, by the way, accelerate the accession process. They cut out the whole MAP plan and so forth, but they could have gone farther. But the reason they can't is because single countries can actually object to that. But there has to be a security guarantee, number one. Number two, there has to be a very substantial reconstruction program. Keep in mind, much more than the Marshall Plan was. Marshall Plan in today's dollars is about $120 billion. The estimates for Ukraine are at least $600 billion and climbing with every single night's attack by Kinshal missiles and cruise missiles and Shahid drones and so forth. So that's another big element. But then I would highlight the one that each of you might be able to influence, and that comes back to this winning the peace. It's not enough to have a security guarantee. It's not enough to have a reconstruction plan. It's not even enough to get into the EU. If you really want to succeed, you have to become an investment destination. And companies like KKR don't invest in countries unless there is solid rule of law, unless there is competent, transparent, and honest governance, unless there is a lack of bureaucracy that stymies you, so it has to be functioning. Again, the competent, efficient governance as well. You can't have sectors that are completely dominated by a single company with monopolistic powers. All of this, again, we can go through that. And again, this is what I do for a living, is assess, again, is this a viable country? We're willing to take risk. I convinced our leadership that we needed to go into the Philippines when President Duterte was still the president. And we did a lot of assessments. We did a lot of meetings on the ground. My team went in twice, I went in twice, and then we came back and laid out the factors that we believed were the reasons why we should go in there. By the way, it was also great demographics, also need for infrastructure, also growing middle class and so forth. Ukraine has some extraordinary advantages. I mean, you have a huge number of engineers, you have very well-educated populace, and again, the labor force, by comparison to, say, some Western European countries, is considerably cheaper. You have great IT skills. KKR companies, we own 120 companies around the world, minority investments in another 100. We have thousands of employees in Ukraine, but they're not working for Ukrainian companies, they're working for other companies, because we do big deals. So we don't do venture capital, we don't do adventure capital, we only do big deals. And if you only do big deals, you have to have real confidence in that investment destination. So I would add that third element, or maybe fourth if you take security guarantee, reconstruction plan, with a lot of integrity and safeguards and so forth, and then EU membership. But then it's the institutions that are necessary, because that's what gives the major investors in the world the confidence to invest. And again, this is an attractive, and I didn't talk agriculture, by the way, which is another huge opportunity. So this could be the military industrial capital of Europe. It could be the agricultural capital of Europe. It could be the IT capital of Europe. And you're building stuff right now that a lot of this is going to be very exportable. But will you get big money to come in here and make a bet on Ukraine? That depends on that final. And that's, again, where I would say that those who are getting an education here, they're understanding, again, not just getting a good education in English, but also the values, the principles, that we all hold dear. And then I think Ukrainians hold dear. If that can be transmitted as well and then multiplied, and the multiplier effect takes off, this organization can have an extraordinary impact on this country. And with that, let everyone, I know I'm all that stands between you and the bar, or at least dinner. So thank you very much for another invitation. Thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the kind audience.
General, thank you for this candid and inspirational event. Join us for a round of applause.